Hey Abdul,
Hello.
how's it going?
Going well.
Yeah. So I'm wondering the question you asked me if there was a particular reason you were asking about the difficulty of Rails versus other stuff.
No, I was just curious because I remember Katie showing us like a little graph at the beginning of like our program, and I was kind of trying to figure out where we were on the graph.
Gotcha. Oh. Well, it's less a single point. It's more like it's a cycle that you'll go through at different points, right?
Okay.
Often you end up at that low point when you're either stuck on a really tough lab or you're working on a project and like you're either having a hard time getting started or you're stuck on a bug. So it's more like that's what coding looks like in general versus that's a specific trajectory and that you'll follow the one time.
Okay. All right.
But
That probably makes more sense.
yeah, and it's nice because it gives you because like they're all part of that process. You'll hit those lows where you're questioning your life choices and you're feeling frustrated. Um, but the goal is always to help make that like I think there's a part they show you too. There's like the lowest one. We're trying to minimize how low that low point gets. That's why we offer some support here. I think
Okay.
this is Sandy. How are you, Sandy?
Hey guys, almost done. Still working on my project, but I'm here to learn Rails, so I'm excited.
Yeah, that's okay. And you're not the only one. There are other people finishing up their projects. You do want to like definitely focus on that.
Yeah.
Don't try to like do Rails labs and do that because then it's kind of like it's hard to do two things well. So better to get the one done first. We're going to give it just a minute or two. I know other people RSVP for the study group, so I'm just giving them a little wiggle room to get here, especially for some of the newer folks who are transferred into the cohort.
Yeah, we got a lot of new classmates, right?
We did. We got like 15 new classmates. So, which is kind of cool. I'm figuring out like it's always they're not that everything happens for a reason, but you can always like figure out how to best use your situation, right? So these are 15 people who have already seen a lot of what we're about to learn. So they have a lot to teach you guys and to learn from you guys and so on and so forth. I see Jashima, I see Shamel, Cedric just got here. Cool. Let me do quick check-ins. How are you, Shamel?
I'm good. I'm good. How about yourself?
Perfect. Doing well, thanks. Jashima's
Good.
here, Cedric and Matt. I'm going to go ahead and get started for the sake of time. I do want to say, hey, Cedric, welcome to the cohort. Thanks for joining us. And then the one thing, let me move you guys over. You guys know that I am the worst about getting distracted when I'm on here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and then move you guys over to my second screen. If you're new to the cohort, I tend to get tunnel vision. So if you're asking questions in chat and I don't see them, just somebody yell at me and let me know that there's a question that needs some attending to. Because I do tend to kind of focus on the code in front of me. Let me just get here. Omar's here. Cool. We got a nice big house. So for those of you returning with us, right, one, welcome, right? Or welcome back from break, rather. I really enjoyed having a break week as much as I missed you guys. It was nice to get a little time to relax and rejuvenate. I hope you guys were able to take a little time to at least rest and not totally be working on your projects. But I'm really excited that we're starting Rails. Well, technically yesterday, but this is our first study group. Hopefully you have started moving into the Rails curriculum already. If you're still finishing up your project, it's totally fine. Just try to get that wrapped up as soon as you can, so you're not trying to do all the things at one time. I see Trisha just got here. Hey, Trisha, welcome. So today we're going to do just a general intro to Rails. It'll be a little bit on the lighter side because we're just getting some of the broad strokes for how powerful Rails can be. We'll see things ramp up pretty soon. There's a lot to cover in this mod. Those of you who are transferring in, you've sort of seen that. There are some tricky topics. One of those is actually nested forms. So when you guys get there, for those of you who haven't seen it, when you get to the nested forms lesson, really pay close attention to those. I really like to see everyone in their mod 3 project to use a nested form. It's not that hard. It really shows off your skills as a Rails developer. And it's a nice thing to be able to include in your projects and ultimately in your portfolio, right? So we're thinking ahead a little bit. Some of you guys are like, I'm not ready to think about mod 3 stuff. I'm finishing up mod 2, but we're moving forward, and it's nice to get a sense of like where we're headed. Now Rails is really powerful, right? You guys already have a really simple Sinatra framework under your belt, and Rails really is going to take that up to the next level, right? Today we have a couple of pretty simple goals. We want to be able to make a new Rails app from scratch, which is actually pretty easy. We want to talk about how to create models, controllers, and routes, right? It's a little bit different the way that Rails handles routing, but there are some similarities. And we'll try to kind of clear those up a little bit, right? A lot of you are just dipping your toes into Rails, so it's okay if you haven't seen some of this stuff. And conversely, if you're transferred in, you're welcome to jump in, answer questions, correct me if I fumble, because sometimes I do, but I'm really glad you're all here, right? Before we start though, for those of you guys who haven't really done much Rails yet, what are some things that maybe you've heard about Rails so far? Like, what is your impression of Rails, what Rails is all about? What are rumors you've heard? What are words that you hear associated with Rails?
It does all the magic for you or something?
It's magical. So magical is a term that you'll hear a lot, right? Now, depending on what kind of coder you are, you may or may not like that magic. Some people love it. They write one line of code, it does all the things, it seems almost magical. Some students, that makes them really nervous because they don't understand how it's working, right? There's pros and cons, but Rails can be very magical. What else do we know about Rails?
It's a framework.
Yeah, it's another framework that we can use for making web-based applications, right? Think of it as a souped-up version of Sinatra, right? Sinatra is your tiny sedan. It can do some things for you. Rails is your big truck, right? Sometimes that's more car than you need, but it's also really powerful and can help you accomplish a lot, right? Anything else, right? Maybe you've heard from other students or other programmers, maybe on Reddit or other online forums. Anything you've heard about Rails? Hey, Sergey.
I heard it's easier to put on a server than Sinatra.
Put on a server. Hey, Sergey. I don't know about that part. I guess it depends. Like they're both pretty easy to get running on your server, right? Any of you seen that first Rails lesson where they talk about, here are some things you might have heard about Rails, but, right? You guys recall any of that stuff? Have you seen it?
It's not a language.
Okay, it's true that it's not a language, right? It's built in Ruby, right? I'll just throw a couple out there because sometimes it's nice to clear the air and address some misconceptions. Some people think of Rails as being kind of a more outdated or obsolete framework, right? That's a thing that sometimes programmers will say, right? For a little bit of background, Rails has been around for quite a while at this point, since 2003, and oftentimes it's considered or talked about like it's the main language of startups, right? It's never been the most popular one amongst startups, but it is still really commonly used, right? Some other ones that tend to be used are Django with Python, Phoenix with Elixir, and some others. But even those copied a lot of Rails patterns, things that Rails did really well, right? So by learning Rails, not only are you going to become really great Rails programmers, right? But you're going to be a developer who can really easily hop into other backend code, right? Because by learning Rails, you get a really good set of habits that will make it easier to either keep doing your thing in Rails and do that really well, or hop over to another framework if you want to or need to do that at some other level, right? So it's really setting you up really well for a bunch of different backend frameworks, right? So in a lot of ways, it's the ideal way for you to learn best practices here, because Rails kind of came up with certain ways of doing things and everybody else was like, I really like that. Let's do it that way as well. Right? Now, another thing that students sometimes hear or say is that Rails is slow or it's bloated, but that's really only if you're not using Rails properly. Since it's really easy to get up and running in Rails, which we'll see, it's easy if you're not careful to generate a bunch of stuff that you don't need, right? And now you've got too much code and you might be coding things in a way that affect performance, right? So it's not something that's true of Rails. It might be true if you do not use Rails properly, right? So those are things I just wanted to address kind of right off the bat. I think those are the big ones I hear, right? 1 second, I always get screwed up with the second screen. Cool, right? So Rails was sort of developed in 2003 by this dude, David Heinemeier Hansson, right? He's a Danish guy. Often you'll hear people say just DHH, right? He's kind of a character. He's done all the things. He's got a bunch of books that he's put out. that you're welcome to kind of go through and like read a little bit more about him. He used to be on Instagram. I guess he's not anymore. He's too cool for Facebook and LinkedIn and Instagram. But I used to follow him on Instagram, and he's like all about cars, like fast cars, fancy cars. That's his thing. So that's just kind of a fun FYI. He's kind of an interesting character, right? So you can read a ton about him if you're curious, right? There are three main principles that he used though when he developed Rails, right? One is that it's built in Ruby. That we already know. That's kind of a duh. But another thing that's kind of cool is a lot of the Ruby ethos is built into Rails too, right? So when we think about Ruby, right? Anyone remember the name of the guy who developed Ruby? Yeah. So often he's called Mats, but it's Yukihiro Matsumoto, right? But his whole idea was to create a language that would make programmers happy, right? And there's even a saying called MinSwan, Mats is nice, so we are nice, right? The whole idea is to build a language that people like using that makes people happy. And that's also instilled in Rails, right? Programmer happiness is literally something that DHH kept in mind when he developed Rails, right? The third main thing is that it's using an MVC architecture, which isn't news to us at this point. We've already seen how to implement that in Sinatra, right? Now, the first thing while it's on my mind, right? Rails is massive and it's capable of a ton, right? If we taught you everything that you need to know about Rails in the curriculum, you'd probably retire before you graduate, right? There's just so much there. Hey, welcome, Sydney. Right. So the best advice I can give you, and I try to instill this in you guys early on, right? Every single day when you eat your cereal, like you would read the cereal box, you should be looking at the Rails guides, right? It's going to give you, one, in some ways, clearer documentation than you might see in some lessons, but certainly it has a ton more to work with because Rails is really powerful, right? Two main philosophies that were used when Rails was developed, right, are keeping things dry. We don't repeat ourselves. And then this, you'll probably hear me say hundreds of times during this mod, this concept of convention over configuration, right? What does that mean? Or I guess I should take away the answer before I ask. What does it mean to value convention over configuration?
I want to say it's like valuing the standards or like valuing how Rails works rather than trying to configure it.
Yeah, it's basically like trying to make your life easier by enforcing a certain set of standards and conventions, right? So literally it describes itself. Rails has opinions about the best way to do things, right? These are those conventions we're talking about. Just like Active Record makes certain conventions to run, and Sinatra works based on some of those, Rails has its own set of conventions about the best way to do things. If you follow those rules, it will build the world for you. If you want to go off and kind of build things following your own rules, you're going to have to do a lot of configuring and customization on your own rather, right? But the idea is that if we follow conventions, we don't have to manually configure too many things ourselves, right? There are ways for you to customize things. You can override settings, but we're prioritizing best practices. So we're doing things the Rails way. Cool, right? So if you follow conventions, it's going to do almost all of the work for you, makes it really easy, but otherwise you'll have to do a little bit of extra work. I would say by far, this is my favorite Rails documentation, right? I often get students who ask me like what books I recommend, but generally if you're reading a book on programming, like by the time it's in your hands, it's probably outdated in some capacity, right? So this documentation is really good, easy to navigate, and kept pretty well up to date. So that's really where I would lead you. There's another set of common docs, right? This api.rubyonrails.org. It's maybe not as easy to read. It's a little bit less user-friendly, but also totally fine, right? And I'll link a bunch of other resources if you guys want to poke around as well. If you want to get a little bit more into like how DHH envisioned Rails, if you want to take a deep dive into some of the sort of philosophies behind it and why it does things a certain way, right? You can do that too. The wiki's probably less exciting, but if you wanted to take a deep dive into how it's updated over time, we're currently on Rails 6 now, right? So I'll share some of those resources later. right? Any questions so far? We're chilling. Cool. Right? But the long and the short of it is really that Rails is a super powerful gem and it's real easy to get started, right? If you haven't run Rails on your machine yet, you would do gem install Rails, right? If you're on your local setup, you should have done this already, so you probably don't need to. You can probably go right into making a Rails app, and worst case scenario, you'd get a command not found, so then you might need to go through and install, right? So I'm not gonna run that because I already have it. One thing I wanted to point out, like many programs, it's often really easy to get help from the program on how to use it. You can usually do that with some kind of flag, like a -- help or a -h, right? But right out of the bat, you get a bunch of sort of documentation on things you can do with that resource. Mine looks a little bit funky because you guys who have been in the cohort know I'm having issues with ZSH. So it looks a little bit ugly, but I mostly wanted to point out that for most things you're doing, there usually is an option of getting help just by asking that program, right? We're gonna go ahead and make a new Rails app. Somebody give me a fun name because I'm the worst at this. What do we wanna name our sample app?
Pirate generator.
Oh no, we're gonna call it, I guess we're just gonna call it example. Just because we're not gonna use a pirate model, but I wanted to generate a name. So let's call it my example because I think I've used example, right? So we follow the pattern Rails new and then the name of your app, right? Similarly to how we did with Corneal, right? Because remember, Corneal is actually modeled off of Rails. Brian Emery, the Flatiron student who developed Corneal, he used Rails as a model for how to do that, right? So we see it sort of creates a bunch of stuff for us, right? We call this a cascade, right? It's making a bunch of stuff I'm gonna need. I'm gonna need a README, I know. I'm gonna need a rake file. I need a config.ru, a gem file, so on and so forth. I've got a ton of stuff here in an app folder. Some of it we don't need now, some of it we might need potentially, but it's building all of this stuff for me right out of the box. We're gonna get a couple errors related to, I think it's Webpacker. We'll talk about this in a second. But first, let's go ahead and CD into our app. You guys see I'm queen of typos, so just bear with me. We're gonna open that up. Okay. And we see automatically some of those conventions, right? We get this app folder that has a ton of additional stuff, but also kind of this familiar controllers folder. We get some views and we get some models, right? So that's a convention we're following, MVC. So I think we get not much of anything but the folders right out of the bat. Another file I wanted to point out to you, right? We still get that config.ru. It's got a little less going on than what we've seen in Sinatra, right? But it's still essentially the entry point to our application, right? And Rails is actually cool because a lot of the files, they tell you what you do, or what they do rather. If you're ever wading through them and you're like, what exactly is going on here? It tells us, right? It's being used to start our application, right? We require our environment. And now here, when we were in Sinatra, we would do something like run our application controller. This is a similar idea, but we're running our Rails application, right? It's still that entry point, right? And it's still starting that process of like starting your server, which is listening and waiting for requests so that we can receive them and respond to them, right? So in that sense, it's very similar to Sinatra, right? Another file I'll point out to you that's gonna be important later, I always have a hard time finding this. In this config folder, you get a file called routes. The biggest difference in routing in Rails versus Sinatra is that the routes are separate from the actions. We'll talk about what that means because it's a little jargony, but we'll see our actual routes are in this file. And what we do when we make requests to those routes is handled in another file, right? So one thing I wanted to talk about briefly is generators. You guys don't really formally learn about these too much until later in Mod 3. We've seen a little bit of it in Sinatra because I've like showed you that like on my own accord. But it's really easy in Rails to just kind of write a one-line command and generate a ton of stuff for you. And we call those generators. And there's even a way, I think this will work, Rails. So the longer command is generator, or generate rather. But if you do G, that works just as well. But there's an option to get some help on that command. And I think it should list the various generators you have. So there's a bunch of stuff that you can build in a really like easy, efficient way. The ones that we're gonna tend to use are for controllers, models. Oh, we probably won't. We have used the migration one before. We've done like array create migration name equals whatever, right? It's a similar idea. We're also going to talk about this scaffold generator, which is cool, but problematic in ways that we'll talk about in just a second, right? But again, it's really easy for me to get documentation here on the kinds of things I'm able to do, right? Because the list of things that Rails can't do is probably a lot shorter than the list of what it can do. And there's a lot of customization. We're going to do something real simple. We're going to generate a model for a cat, right? So again, if I wanted to be verbose, I could say Rails generate, but I hate typing. So I'm going to use Rails G. What I want to generate is a model, right? And I'm just going to call that cat. I'm going to keep it simple, right? And see, just by doing that, it built a few different things for me, right? It made a migration file for me, right? It's got nothing in it for the time being, right? It made me a model, and also it made me some test stuff. I don't actually need that, so I'm creating excess code. The biggest thing with generators is like building stuff that you don't need, and that's where this bloat comes in that some people talk about, right? It's best to not build things unless you're sure you're going to need them, right? But it built all that for me. Not too much is actually inside. So I think it was just that simple cat model. And then I still have a DB folder, and now it's got a migration, right? So that's not too different. We've seen how to do that in Sinatra. One thing I want to show you just to help avoid some issues you might see in labs. If you use generators in labs, the one thing you want to remember to do is use this special flag so that it doesn't create tests for you, right? If you're working in a lab, sorry, I got distracted because Josh asked a question in the Slack channel. Sorry. If you're working in a lab, it's already got its own tests for you, so you don't want to create duplicate tests or different tests that are potentially going to confuse you. So the way to avoid doing that is you use this flag, no test framework. So what that's going to do is it's going to generate all the stuff that you do want. So in this case, that's a model and our migration, but it's not going to generate this test stuff, right? Because sometimes that can give you confusing errors working on a lab, and you have to go back and delete all those extra tests. And it's better just to avoid the situation. So like get in the habit of making sure that this is here if you're using a generator. One thing we can also do that I want to show you, let's say I wanted to undo what I just did. This is my weird ZSH stuff. If I wanted to undo what I just generated, there's a command for that. It's called destroy, or you can use D for short. So you can say Rails, I think it's Rails, yeah, Rails D model. So I want to destroy that model stuff I just created for cat, right? And again, I could type it out as destroy, but D also works because Rails likes giving us options, right? And what did it do? It just undid all of that. It got rid of those test things, right? And our model and our migration, right? So these are things like destroy, they don't even teach you in the lessons, and generators don't come till later. So we're getting a little flavor of some of the things we can do ahead of time. Now,
Invoke that's up there that says invoke active record, we don't have to worry about that, right?
I think it's not something to worry about. It's more like telling you a thing that it's doing. I imagine it's like something related to working with the active record gem, but it's not making a thing for you. It's just relying on another gem to help with that, I guess. That's how I would think about it. Good question. Cool. Now we're going to start a Rails server, but there's an issue here. I think some of you have run into this already. In theory, it's easy to run a Rails server right out of the box, but there are some bumps and bruises related to the most recent update to Rails. We're in 6.0 with something called Webpacker. Right? Anyone know what Webpacker does?
Not entirely, but doesn't it? It kind of works like Shotgun, doesn't it? Where it like sends. I don't know. I'm making this up as I go, but I know that it's like something to do with like the way the local host interacts with the Rails application or something of the other.
It's sort of related to the way that Rails deals with JavaScript, right? So in the future, like in Mod 4, you guys are going to be building applications that use Rails for the backend and JavaScript for the front end. But Webpacker is related to how Rails handles JavaScript, and in Rails 6, it now defaults to Webpacker. So there are some issues with that. So I'm going to try this out, but it likely will break. But if I run Rails test, yeah, you're going to get an error that looks something like this. Webpacker configuration file not found. Please run Rails Webpacker, yada, 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 right? Kind of that standard error. There are a few different ways to fix it. I'm going to give you guys one way that I think is going to have like the broadest effectiveness. If you've done your local setup, you should have installed NPM. So we're going to install Webpacker with NPM because you guys should have it already. So the way that I could do this is I write NPM, and I think it's I at Rails Webpacker, right? I think you, Josh, you and Thomas were talking about this yesterday, and you used Yarn. I think sometimes students who are on WSL have issues with Yarn, so that's another reason I'm showing it this way. But alternatively, you could install Yarn and then use that to install Webpacker. I'm just going to do it this way though, because it's easy.
Is Yarn, so Yarn is just another package manager?
Yeah.
Okay. And I don't have to worry about keeping it on my computer or anything?
No. It's probably going to be useful, right? This is just another package manager, node package manager, which generally is used to handle JavaScript stuff, right? And we see it does a whole bunch of magic. It'll do its thing in just a second. And we'll also see, like, there are other things you could do. You could downgrade your Rails version. You could remove the Webpacker gem. These are all things that would work for our purposes for right now. I'm going to check the chat real fast. Cool. Here. Okay, so Thomas is here. The Ruby Racer gem. Thanks, Thomas. Also, welcome. Cool. We have a nice crowd. For those of you guys. Yep.
Just going back a little bit. So when you install Rails and you install this framework, could you say there's like a similarity between that and installing Corneal, because they both give you that automatic like file structure?
Well, yeah, you're just installing gems in both cases, right? And those gems similarly give you a command where you can generate a new app quickly by using that new command.
So Rails is a gem too.
Yes, Rails is a big old gem.
Okay,
perfect. I'm going to run bundle install because now I need to actually install that Webpacker, which didn't install properly the first time. I'm going to go ahead and in this config folder, where am I at? You see, I'm going to make a file called webpacker.yaml, right? That's what it's complaining about not having. And then the last thing I need to do, and I've learned the hard way that you have to format this just so, is we're going to add a key for development. You have to get the spacing right. And then it's going to be dev server. And then it's host, localhost, host, and then port 3000. And then if I did everything.
Why are you doing this?
Sorry?
Why are you doing this? Just because the way Webpacker works and.
Yeah, so it's complaining about not having this file, and then this is configuring the actual file properly.
Okay.
Right? We'll look at an easier way to handle it, but again, this is the way that a TC would probably help you with this, so I'm also doing it to be consistent with that, right? So now that that's situated, I should be able to go ahead and run my server. Okay, we get some warnings, but we see similar to like when we were working in Sinatra, we kind of get this listening message. But in this case, the port is 3000 rather than 9393. But we're up and running. And in theory, we should be able to go over to 3000. Okay. And we see we're up on Rails. right? So aside from some issues with Webpacker, it's relatively easy to go ahead and get started. There's one little thing I'm going to handle that's going to rear its head later. And I'll tell you why I'm doing this, but I also want to illustrate a point, so I'm getting the ugly stuff out of the way first. There's a file in your views called application.html, right? This is essentially your layout, right? Similar to what we saw in Corneal, right? It's yielding the other views, but it really doesn't like this tag for some reason I haven't figured out yet. I'm going to find a more graceful way to handle this, but I'm going to delete this for the time being so I can illustrate this next point that I'm looking to do rather dramatically, right? So my next question for you guys, how many of you think you can get a full CRUD app up and running in less than 10 minutes? Okay, some of you do. Full CRUD stuff?
Yes.
Okay, a couple of you are confident. You're faster than me. For sure, I would make more than my fair share of typos in 10 minutes, right? Can somebody time me?
Time you.
Yeah, like with a stopwatch,
Okay.
right? Let me know when it's fair to go.
Okay.
I'm gonna make a fully functioning Rails CRUD app.
3, 2, 1, go.
Oh man, pressure's on. Oop, we see one typo. And then it should be.
Don't hit enter.
No, what did I do? Ah, I see.
Color and Boolean.
Ooh, I might epically fail here, but you'll see. I'm trying to illustrate a point. That should do its thing. Don't break all the things. Cool. How long did that take me?
50 seconds.
50 seconds. So less than a minute. That's not half bad,
Not bad.
right? Not half bad. We'll talk about what exactly I did there, but again, trying to illustrate a point rather dramatically. I'm going to go ahead and make a get request to dogs if I can spell it right.
That's
Still
the
can't.
magic. You were
Still
talking.
can't. I'm trying, right? So right away, well, I don't have any dogs yet. I could have seeded it, but I'm going to go ahead and make a new dog. I've done this a few different times, as we can see. Make a collie called Lassie. I can't spell color. I messed that up in my generator. I'll have to fix that in a sec. But brown, will it work or will it break other things? We'll see. That seems to work. Let's go back. I can make a new dog. Let's say that's a German Shepherd, right? It's got another color, and let's say it's not adopted, right? I get flash messages. I can view a single dog. I can go back. I see all of my dogs, right? I can look at an individual one. I can edit a dog. The one thing I can't do, and I haven't figured out why this is actually broken, the delete functionality. I don't know if that's a thing I've done with Webpacker. I don't think it should be related to Webpacker, but for some reason, this destroy functionality is broken. So I'm gonna poke around with that. But for all practical purposes, in less than a minute, I've got full CRUD stuff built out, right? Which is kind of amazing. And it's also why this generator that I used, right? You are not allowed to use it when you do your Mod 3 project. If there's one thing you take away from today, is that this generator for scaffolding, it builds a ton of stuff for you, which sounds great, but there are some real drawbacks to that. You cannot use this scaffold for your Mod 3 project. It will be obvious if you have done it, unless you want to spend hours deleting a bunch of stuff that you don't need. So better to just avoid going through that route. And there are major downsides for using it, but I just wanted to illustrate, like, one of the reasons why Rails is so favored by startups is because you can get an app up and running relatively quickly. Okay. Now I'm imagining I'm going to run into some weird bugs because of that typo I had with the color. What's the easiest way to fix that and not drive myself bonkers? Rails, C, scaffold, dogs. Will that do the thing? No. ask. Oh, I don't actually remember doing that. There we go. Cool. So it just undid what I did. I just want to get rid of that typo. I have a lot of issues with editing commands in ZSH. That should do it. Build it again. No, see, now it's got. I'm going to do it again, less dramatically, just manually typing it, because I'm going to have a hard time actually getting this to work right by editing what I typed previously. But I can explain what I'm doing as I'm doing it, right? So we're just using the scaffold command, which is going to build a ton of that stuff for us. What I can do is write the name of the model or resource I want. So I'm building a dog resource, right? And now what I can do in this command, like I could do if I were generating a migration via a migration command or a generator command, is I can specify the actual attributes and what data types I'd like them to have, right? And yes, Abdul, the drawback is bulkiness. That's one of them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to specify my attributes. And the default behavior is if you don't specify the data type, it is going to use a string. So I could do the string for that attribute, but that's also the default behavior. So less typing for me, right? So my dog's got a breed, it's got a name, it's got a color, and it's got another attribute of whether or not it's adopted. This is not going to be a string. So I'm going to make that a Boolean, right? And then mostly out of habit, I'm going to not generate any tests. No test framework, right? Third time is a charm, right? And again, what the heck did that just do? It not only gave me my models and my migration, it's going to generate my routes. We'll talk about this in a sec. It's giving me a whole bunch of views, some that I do not need, right? So that's the bulkiness that Abdul was talking about. It's too much car. It's giving us the stuff that we need and a ton of other stuff that we don't, right? Which is another reason why we ask that you not use that for your project, right? But it's a nice little dramatic thing to show you guys what we can do in Rails. All right, let me go ahead and get that up and running. Any questions so far? If you're new to the cohort, I dance frequently. So just get used to that, right? So I get a model. Let me actually open, do I have this open already? I do. Right. So I not only get that model, it doesn't have anything going on, but for the most part, unless you're customizing, you don't have to build a ton in here. It gives me a ton of different views, right? And it gives me, where do we go, right? A hefty controller. Right? Some of this stuff, you guys have the vocabulary to sort of like wrap your head around. So like some of you use before action filters in your Sinatra project. So that sort of makes sense. And a lot of this we have seen before, right? We have the context of like methods that we define. We've got something for index that grabs all my dogs. We've got a show, but it looks a little different than we're used to. We've got new, but it looks a little different. And we've got some code that's going to look way different, particularly for our code in Rails, right? So another reason why we ask that you not use scaffolding is for some of those reasons, right? It's better to get in the habit of knowing what you need and building it out as you go, right? I think we're okay on time. One thing I wanted to show you, I'm curious if any of you, if we look at this create method here, do you guys know what this respond to do stuff is all about? And kind of all this jargon here. It's not that important for our purposes now, but it's going to come up in the next two mods. Anyone know what that's all about? I'll give you a hint.
I mean, clearly the create is creating the dog, but you're asking what does respond to do?
Yeah. Yeah, it's not quite for fetching an object. It has to do with how our backend is going to respond with data, right? What we're doing in mod 3 is we're using Rails to handle not only the backend stuff, but the front end. We're rendering views, right? But that's not all that Rails can do. In mods 4 and 5, we're going to be handling our backend strictly with Rails, but then we're going to be using either JavaScript or a JavaScript framework for our front end, and it's going to consume data from our API that we're building in Rails, right? So we have the option to either essentially render some HTML to the user, or we can render JSON. If you think back to your mod 2, or not 2, mod 1 projects, remember we built that bartender app together and we practiced making a request to an endpoint in the API and getting back all this JSON data?
Yes.
Yeah, so I actually have an app that knows how to do that as well. Okay, if I go ahead and run my server, I'm not going to do it with post. I'm going to change this up just a little bit. But if I run this, let me see if I can get this to work on the first try. I can either choose to go to /dog, so I'm making a GET request, right? It's going to respond by giving me an error. Oh, that's because I went back and forth on those scaffold things over and over. There we go. No. Doesn't know. It doesn't know. And you could also do Rails instead of Rake. What doesn't it know how to do? It should. Oh yeah. Rails GB. I'm totally doing that correctly. I'm in my application and it's angry about something. Okay, we're here. That all looks okay.
When you did the delete, when you deleted the scaffolding, did it still keep the schema file and the database information?
Well, I appreciate you. Thanks, Josh. We're gonna delete and we're going to, but even still, that looks correct. Don't actually know what it's angry about here. Some errors. Am I able to?
What if we do a rake DB rollback?
Well, I mean, we can try. Oh, wait, that's not what I meant to do. Right. DB reset. Oh, it's like actually having an issue. We're gonna start fresh. We're gonna do example. I'm just gonna call it example. Cool. Cool. What I'm going to do for the sake of time, another thing you can do is just comment out that Webpacker gem so you don't have to deal with the same issue again. Where are we at? Bundle. Cool. And then we're just going to run that generator for the sake of time. Cool. Pressure. Okay. And then that's what I was telling you guys about before. It's got an issue with this tag for reasons I'm not clear on just yet, but that's in our views, which is going to be in layouts. That's this guy here. Cool, right? So we're now in a better place. I think what I wanted to show you guys was that we could also do .json. That was like the point I was trying to illustrate. And if we had some dogs, we would get back some JSON here. Massey, multi, right? So I could make a request to .json, and I'm literally serving up some JSON data from my application, right? Which we're going to be doing a ton of in mods 4 and 5. So it was kind of a bumpy path to illustrate that point, right? That's something we're going to be making use of eventually, just not so much in this mod, but that's kind of why there's all this extra goodness happening in some of those controller actions, right? But again, like that's kind of the drawback for using scaffolding. It's building you stuff that you may or may not need for the time being, right? Cool, 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 cool. Skipping ahead a little bit, right? But really the takeaway is that we haven't even written one line of code ourselves in our application, and already it can do just about anything that we need to out of the box as far as our CRUD functionality, right? One thing I do want to focus on, we're not going to get it quite as far as I wanted to, but we're going to get to the main stuff. I'm going to get rid of some of this noise for just a second, right? Just to kind of focus on some of the differences and similarities in how we handle routing in Rails, right? This essentially is telling our program what to do if we want to see all the dogs, right? One thing that confuses students when they start is kind of the ways that Rails and Sinatra are really similar, but like kind of different in some ways, right? So one thing we can do, like if we were in Sinatra mode, how would I write out a route that lets me make a GET request to see all of my dogs? How would I do that? What would that look like? The majority of you guys have just been like spending 3 weeks doing this.
So get.
Okay, so I need a method, right, for a request type.
Yeah, and the apostrophes within dogs. Is that what
Yeah,
you're-
so I need a string, right? Because Sinatra's a DSL. It's just using a method, right? A method that takes in an argument of a matching pattern, right? Like a string most typically, right? And then this is going to be dogs, right?
do.
Right? And then do, we need a block,
And
right? And what do I need,
ERB.
right? Because I'm going to render a view, right? And what's the RESTful pattern? What do we name that view?
Index.
Right, and also I forgot my slash. You'll get weird errors if you do that, right? So that's index, and I probably need to do something in between those two steps. What else do I need here?
Logic.
Yeah, yes. Specifically, what kind of logic?
You need some sort of instance variable.
Yeah, right, because if I want to render it in the view, it's got to be scoped to the view, so I need an instance variable, right? So that tends to be kind of what we're doing here, yeah? Right? If I want to get all my dogs so that I can list those, right? I'm going to use Active Record to help me out and ping my database, get all the data for my dogs. I spin up all my dog objects, right? So that itself is exactly the same, but there are some differences here, right? I'm going to use some terminology here because students often get confused with what to call what, right? When we're looking at this part of this method, often that's referred to as a route, right? And these are the steps we take when we match to that route. So the user makes a GET request to dogs. We're pattern matching that. And if we see get/dogs, we're going to respond by getting all of them and rendering a view, right? The biggest difference in routing in Rails versus Sinatra is this route stuff is not anywhere in this controller file. It has its own separate file for that, right? So what we would do, right, is we would go over into this config folder. There's a file called routes, right? There's a few different ways that you can do this because Rails likes giving you options, but the simplest, most explicit pattern, I'll actually show you an example. The Rails routing docs are really, really good and give you lots of options, right? Right, it's called Rails routing from the outside in, right? But the way we would typically do this is we'd still specify an HTTP method verb, right? And some kind of string to represent a path. But then we're going to do something called mapping. We're going to connect it to some controller and specifically a method in that controller, right? So we're going to say, if we make a GET request to /patient/ID, right? We're going to go ahead to a controller with this name and look for a method by this name that we often call an action, right? So we would do something like this. I'm still making a GET request, and it's still to/dogs. But if I do that, I want to head over to a controller whose name is dogs, right? It's my dogs controller, right? Dogs. And I'm going to look for a method called index. That's my action. That's the biggest difference in routing between the two, that we've separated those two pieces out into different files, right? But we're still making the same request type. And even here, we're not making it, we're just matching the request that's received, right? And we're saying, hey, head over to that dogs controller, right? It knows when we say dogs, we're referring to that controller. And then we're going to find this method, right? So that's one major difference, right? Any questions about that piece specifically? Are you guys alive? You doing okay? Hanging in there, thumbs up. You okay, Omar? Cool, we're chilling, right? The other difference here is how we're rendering a view, right? For those of you who have seen this, which is a number of you, like, why don't I need to render a view here? What's special about what Rails is doing here?
Isn't the fact that it's called index, it'll look through and look for a file name index and then render that view.
Yeah, so there's some Rails magic here. The default behavior in Rails, what it will do for you without you having to do any extra work, is if you have an action, which is what this is, right? It's the actual method. By default, right? If you're not explicitly rendering or redirecting somewhere, it's going to do two things. It's going to look in a folder in your views that matches the name of the controller, right? So it's going to look in your views folder, and it's expecting that dogs folder to live there. And inside of that folder, it's going to look for a view that has this name. That is what Rails does by default for you, right? If you want to do something different, you got to configure it yourself, but this is the convention that it follows. I totally could render explicitly. I can do render, brain fart. I could render index. I think that should work. You can also do it as a string. But the default behavior is that it's going to look for something that's got the same name and try to render that, right? Another thing, this is actually wrong, the way we put this in Sinatra, right? One thing, Rails is smarter than Sinatra in that it knows to look in that nested folder. If we actually were in Sinatra, this would break because it's not smart enough to know that there should be a folder that has those views. We would actually have to tell it, hey, go into our dogs folder and find that file called index. You guys remember that, running into those bumps, right? But that's the main difference there. We get a little bit of magic, it's rendering that view, and also we get the route that's being handled in a separate file. Okay. Any questions about that bit so far?
Is it okay for you to show us, like, say we did one index or we wanted something else with index, how would that work?
We wanted something else with index. So yeah, I mean, you can totally like make another file with that name and just do render and then the name of that file.
Oh, okay.
Right? So it's pretty similar in that regard. Cool. Another thing I wanted to show you, we are coming close to the end, so I wanted to get into customizing some of your route helpers, but we can talk about that on Thursday. One thing, we'll talk about this in a second. One thing you want to do early and often when you're working in labs or in your project is get a sense of what routes you have available to you, right? For some reason, this format's really ugly for me. I don't know if it's related to my terminal or something that's different in Rails now. You get a bunch of extra stuff that I don't remember ever being the case. A way that you can get around that is you can use essentially this flag here of grep and then the name of like what resource you want to see the routes for. So in this case, that's going to be dog. That's what we're working with, right? But if we run that, we see, and again, it's like formatting weird for reasons that are unclear to me. But you get a prefix for something called a route helper. It's building you a method called dogs path that you can then use in your views and your controllers. It's also building you another method called dogs URL if you wanted the full string of the URL domain, right? That's nice because like you guys who just finished up your Sinatra projects, right? Writing in HTML and like filling out your forms and manually coding in strings, it's one, really tedious, and two, really bug prone, right? If you miss a forward slash or you make a typo, it's a pain to debug those issues. So Rails builds a helper method that you can use instead, right? It's going to handle your get request to /dogs, which is then mapped to your dogs controller's index action, right? This resource is here. For those of you guys who have seen it, what does it actually do for you? What have you seen?
Creates the whole CRUD.
Yeah, it's going to build, I think that, was that Trisha?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Yeah, it's going to build like, well, in this case, it's going to build your 8 RESTful routes. So it's going to give you all the stuff you would need in theory for crudding dogs, right? It's just building them for you. That's part of the Rails magic. You could build them all explicitly yourself, but if you're not doing anything customized, why would you want to do that if there's a way that Rails can do it for you, right? So what I'm going to do just to compare is run that again. Right. And then I think, Josh, you were saying we can get rid of this warning by commenting out that gem. Thanks for that tip because it's been driving me crazy. But we get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 methods. The reason it's 8 and not 7 is because we get the put and the patch, right? Remember we talked in mod 2 about, I think patch is for updating part of the resource and put technically updates the whole thing, but that's why we're getting the 1 extra one here, right? But what does it build for me? It builds me a dogs path method, right? That's the one that we just talked about. It gives me a post, right? There's no helper for that because that's not a get request. It's not for a view, right? But it's going to let me post to all my dogs for my create action, right? I get a new dog path that will take me to the view that allows me to make a new dog, right? It's got a form, right? When I build that, right? I get an edit dog helper. I get a dog, well, edit dog path, dog path. It's building all of those for me, right? But if you're working with an application where you don't need all of those, maybe you need a couple of them only, there are ways you can customize that too. So let's say I only wanted to have the index action. There's a way to do that in Rails. I can say, hey, only give me index. That's the only one that I want out of those, but I don't want to manually code that myself, right? That's just going to build that one for me, right? Maybe I want a few, maybe I want a couple, right? Say I want index and show, right? There's a way to do that in Rails, right? Maybe I want all of them except for one, right? There's a way to do that in Rails. Maybe I want everything except the destroy action. I don't need this guy anymore, right? Right? I should get everything but that guy, right? So there's nothing here related to deleting or destroying, right? So one thing that, again, it's going to depend a little bit on the kind of programmer you are. If you like having a lot of options, it's great, right? You have a lot of ways that you can do the same thing. But if you're someone who finds that stressful or you really get hung up on why we do it one way versus the other, it's just worth knowing that there are a lot of ways that we can do the same task in Rails. And it mostly can be filtered through like, how do we build what we need and not necessarily much more than that, right? But there are a few different ways of doing the same thing. Cool. I wanted to kind of go through and do some more examples, but we're pushing up against time. I think we can do it. Hey, Angel. I just saw you. I think that's it for... I think I'm going to pause here and just take time for questions. And then maybe we'll look 1 second if we want to customize those route helpers. Are there any questions on what I've covered so far?
Hey, Dominique.
Yeah, who's this?
This is Puya.
Oh, hey, Puya. Yeah, I'm not always good about knowing who's who, but I know I remember working with you and ask a question. How are you, Puya?
I'm good, thank you. I'm glad I just joined your cohort, and I was just kind of going through the Rails, kind of like a review.
Okay.
I wanted to look at the controller again. You know, where you had, you know, controller actions, before action,
Okay.
set dog. What is that set dog was again?
Anyone remember or who has seen this before? Like what exactly this is referring to?
Isn't that a private method that was created?
Yeah, so we've got a private method down here, and some of you guys, I showed you how to do this with helpers in your Mod 2 project, but we're basically setting a method that we can then call like under certain conditions, right? So this is essentially a helper method that we're working with, just so we can get around this like repetitive code of like @dog is dog.find that dog, right? You guys saw from your Sinatra project, you often had to repeat that in a number of your controller actions. You need it in show, you need it in edit, you need it in delete. We're all about being dry and not repeating ourselves. So we separate it out into a method and we're saying, hey, before any of these actions, right, I want you, well, when I say these actions, I mean the ones that are included. So before my show action, before my edit, before my update, before my destroy, I want you to go ahead and call that method and get that dog. So I don't have to keep manually repeating that, right?
Oh, instead of like doing it using similar, like duplicate all the lines in like different,
Yeah.
like a show or like, okay,
Perfect.
or
Right.
updates.
You can also check those out formatted on the browser by using Rails info routes. I'm not actually sure what you mean, Thomas, but I'm curious to learn more. Rails info routes. So you're saying like, not actually sure what he means, but
I think it's like in the actual browser when you're doing your localhost dot or /Rails info route
slash Rails.
in the browser.
Gotcha. So like if I'm running the server and then doing it, or do you mean like in the docs?
No, yeah, like he just put it up there.
Gotcha. Rails. Oh, nice. I did not know that. I learned a thing today. Info. Nice. I actually didn't know that. See, this is why I'm really excited that a lot of you guys are joining us to kind of give some tips and tricks. I didn't know. We're all learning from each other, which is great. But yeah, it's definitely a heck of a lot nicer looking than doing it in my terminal. So I really appreciate that. But yeah, this is what we were saying. We're building some helper methods that we can use to dry up our views. We'll look at that a little bit more next time, right? And if you ever wanted to customize what those are called, this is, you guys will see this in a lab. I want to say it's this week, I'm pretty darn sure. You can use an option called as, right? So let's say for whatever reason, I wanted to customize this name, right? I don't want it to use the default, which is to give me, where did it go? To give me a dog's path method, right? Maybe I want to call it like my super cool dogs. It doesn't matter for this purpose. But if I wanted to customize what that's called for whatever reason, right? And I should have a really good reason for doing that because I should be routing RESTfully unless I'm working with a route that's like not falling under the RESTful conventions, right? So I should only be customizing if I know I need to, but I can do it in Rails. I can do that with the as option, and we're just gonna call it something silly. I think I can do it an underscore super cool dog. Is that gonna work or is that gonna break? We'll see. Right, and then actually this is better. If I refresh, it gotta have the server running. Cool. Let me see. Is that? Yeah. So again, it's just customizing the name of that thing, right? You don't have to do that very often, but it is a thing that you're able to do in Rails. So that's kind of the last thing that I wanted to illustrate. I did want to spin up another quick one, but it was mostly just to kind of reinforce some of these concepts, but we're going to come back to these Thursday. So I think that's okay. think I'm missing anything major, right? Okay, two last things and then I'll wrap up with a couple questions, right? So one thing I've seen, not so much this week, but especially the week before break, for those of you like who have been with us for Mod 2, when I work with you on your projects, I get a lot of language that feels like you're apologizing for what you've built, right? Like there's something wrong or like it could be better. What I want you to think back to is like on day one, back in Ruby, like most of you didn't know how to do much of anything that now you totally know how to do, right? Between now and then, we've learned Ruby, we've learned object orientation, we've learned about using active record, connecting to our database using like active record as our ORM, right? We've already started working with our second web framework, right? So think about how far you've come since March 23rd, right? In the midst of a pandemic and the world being on fire and lots of crazy things happening, like it's always going to be a much longer list of things that you don't know how to do versus what you do, right? That's not something that I enjoy because I like knowing all the things, but it's a reality of programming. It's just going to be ongoing learning. So for those of you who haven't assessed yet, like be confident in what you've built. Like that's a thing that started from nothing that you made yourself and now it works and it does all these cool things, right? So that's what conversation that I wanted to have with some of you guys because I think it's important. And just to sort of end, like look how cool it is in Rails that now we can do all of those things and then some just in a little under 1 minute and without writing much code at all myself, okay? So I kind of wanted to end on that note to give you a sense of where we're going. And again, just to underscore that you guys have learned a ton and it can be easy on your end to focus on like what you're still working on. Does that make sense? Cool. Any last minute questions, concerns, bad jokes, things I can clear up?
I like your energy. Thank you. I'm new, so.
Yeah, I'm definitely a nervous creature and I compensate for that by little silly things. I've been a little nervous with all of the recent transfers, new faces in the group. I'm hoping I didn't muddy the waters too much in some of this stuff with the intro to Rails, but we'll reinforce a lot of it on Thursday too. But thank you for that, Trisha. Any last minute questions, things I can clear up? Everybody learn at least. Oh, thanks, Thomas. I appreciate you. Cool. All right. And we'll grow together. You'll see. These guys have already seen. I'll warm up a little bit and get less nervous. But first study group after project mode kind of takes you back, right? Before we end, can someone share 3 glows from working on their projects? Like things that went well or things that you're proud of?
Mastering error messages. Not really mastering, just get them to work.
You like brought that down really quickly, but like, no.
Definitely a feat.
Definitely a feat, right? It's a labor of love building a project, right? I was talking with, like I started the study group talking to Abdul. When you guys first start, there's kind of that curve they display when they're doing the orientation about like what it's like to be a programmer, right? It's not a thing you go through once, it's gonna be up and down and it's just part of the journey. And it's easy to, as you're transitioning from one mod to the next, for those of you who maybe are still finishing up the project, you're totally fine. Yell at me, I will help you with things. We all want you to continue and be successful. And yeah, but we're also gonna keep moving because we've got some things to accomplish before February 11th-ish when you guys graduate. We got some stuff. Cool. Last call for questions. Now we're good. All right, well, on that note, you guys have a lovely night. It's been a pleasure meeting some of you newbies. I'm happy that you were able to lurk here. Maybe in the future you could turn on your video cameras. I'm not scary. I will not do much of anything than make typos and entertain you guys as much as I can. But y'all have a great night.
Thank you, Tommy.
All right, take it easy. Bye.